Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first day of Davos. My name is Sarah Noble, and I'm the Director of External Relations at IRIN News, who is co-organizing this event today together with Mastercard and the International Committee of the Red Cross. We're delighted to be here live from Davos, and we have a great lineup for you today. For those of you that don't know IRIN, we are a non-profit newsroom that is reporting on some of the key issues of our time. So we're reporting on refugees, migration, conflicts, and disasters. And our on-the-ground reporting amplifies the voices of those who are often not heard and brings them to the decision makers. So this is one of the reasons why we're having our panel here today. And we really live in a changing world. We're seeing that today's humanitarian crises in one region have global impacts, and people can no longer be immune to what's happening in faraway places, and everything is affecting all of us. We also see that the responses are changing, and we have a lot of new actors, what at IRIN we like to call it new humanitarians, who are active in responding to humanitarian disasters and crises. And you not only need to be a part of the formal humanitarian structure to make a difference. And our role as a media organization is to provide people with quality, independent news, which is also now needed more than ever, to help people really understand the world around them and help them understand what these crises mean, and so that they perhaps in their own lives can make a difference. IRIN will be changing its name at the end of March to, surprise, surprise, the New Humanitarian, so this panel is very timely. But without further ado, we're using the hashtag New Humanitarian, and we have a webcast today, so welcome to our online viewers. And I will now pass over to IRIN's director, Heba Ali, who is a seasoned journalist who's reported for more than a decade from conflict zones. She's also a young global leader. So Heba.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. It is great to see a full house so bright and early at the start of the crazy Davos week. At IRIN and soon at the New Humanitarian, these are the kinds of voices that we try to feature in our journalism, and the kinds of voices that we would like to be increasingly reaching with our journalism. As Sarah said, this isn't any longer the domain of just the official humanitarians, and it's time that these issues reach a much wider audience. So I'm very excited about this conversation, not because I think many of the people in this room, and actually let's get a sense of the people in this room. How many of you are working for aid agencies? Okay, about 5, 10. How many are in the tech or private sector? Okay, 15-ish. Government? 1? 2? Any other profiles? Academics? Social entrepreneurs? Great, Davos has become the home of social entrepreneurs. I think many of you in this room will not be surprised by the fact that there are many new entrants into the field of humanitarian response. So the conversation today is not meant to tread on the need to collaborate and all the rest of it that many of us have heard many times, but rather to have a more raw conversation about what it means to be a humanitarian in this day and age when the stakes are so high. So I'm going to kick things off with Tara Nathan, to my right, who's the Executive Vice President of Mastercard for Humanitarian and Development, and leads a 20-person team that targets underserved and excluded people with infrastructure that gives them access to non-cash transactions. And the reason I want to start with Tara is because when I approached her about partnering with us for this event, she was immediately in. And this is an issue that you have been passionate and frustrated about, if I can say so, for some time. Walk us through why you feel so strongly about this issue of new humanitarians. And I should give you a microphone to do so.
I think
Jetzt ist Switch. Someone should switch this off.
Hello? Hello!
Let's take this one, please.
Hi, good morning, and thank you all for coming so bright and early. Oh gosh, I'm supposed to talk about my frustrations first thing in the morning.
I told Tara the one condition is you have to be angry.
I'm too sleepy to be angry. Look, I think the frustration for me has been the following. As a private sector citizen, what we're seeing is that we as a company, first of all, have had a long-standing vision, mission about doing good in the world, okay? We've set a corporate objective to be a force for good in the world. This is not part of our CSR. So one of the things that Heba had mentioned is that I run a team for Mastercard, a global team, that's all about figuring out how we can leverage our core competencies as a company. That means our technology, it means our innovation labs, it means our data scientists, it means our franchise specialists, our legal folks, how we can deploy these people to create products and solutions that create impact in the humanitarian development sphere. Okay? So what does that mean? And why are we doing this? We're doing it because we've realized that our employees are demanding it of us. That not only is it a fun thing to do, is it a feel-good thing to do, but, you know, and it was really interesting. I was blessed by Edelman, thank you, Edelman, who came out with their trust poll yesterday. And the trust poll basically revealed exactly what we've been seeing and feeling for the past, I would say, decade. And that is that 85% of all employees look to their employers now to be agents of social change, even more than their governments. That they trust their employers and their CEOs more than their governments, and that they're looking for their companies to be their voice of social change. So in that environment, in that context, you can see that from our perspective, we consider the 10,000 Mastercard employees all humanitarians. And sometimes it can feel like it's an us versus them dialogue, and we want to figure out how we make it more of an us.
And what kind of reaction, you know, you've been coming to these kinds of gatherings for 5 years now. What has been the evolution of trying to have people consider you genuinely as a humanitarian?
I mean, there's definitely been a positive trajectory. There's been a positive trajectory. I think when we started out, like you said, probably in the sphere, maybe 8 years ago, it was it was definitely two camps. I think now what you see and what you hear is a lot of alignment, a lot of discussion around public-private partnerships, around engaging the private sector. I think that's all positive. I think at the most senior levels of organizations, you hear a lot of discussion around an acknowledgement that the private sector has a real role to play. To it, you know, we have the honor and pleasure of co-chairing the Humanitarian Council at WEF, okay? So I think there's a lot of narrative and dialogue around it. We've got great partnerships with all the major NGOs and you know, many of the UN organizations around the globe. And so that's all very positive. I think where we have still a journey to go is watching that cultural shift, that cultural message of trust between public and private permeate throughout the ranks of the organizations, so that we can result in joint intervention and not just collaboration at the panel level. You know, we collaborate very well at panels. And what I'd like to see is how can we bring that collaboration down into the field, where we're actually side by side implementing solutions, addressing refugee needs, addressing the needs of the local communities.
And what I've been interested in some of our conversations is that you, in a sense, you know, humanitarian action in the modern age has been defined as professional agencies delivering assistance to people in need. And to me, you're trying to redefine that term, or kind of reclaim it in a sense, that it's much broader than that.
Yeah, and I would ask, so, you know, I would ask Peter and others in the humanitarian sort of world to actually speak to this as well. I think there's a general trend or an acknowledgement that when you think about humanitarian, we need to think about the development. We need to think about the journey, if you will, from humanitarian response through to development. So a lot of the work that our council has been really focused on is this knowledge of, if you really want to address humanitarian needs, you have to go to the causes and conditions of what cause these situations to arise. So how can we focus on building local market capacity in fragile markets as a means to, you know, obviate sort of crises in the first place, but then also to build resilience, you know, post facto. And I think that's a lot of, when you start to talk about building local markets as as a prevention, if you will, going to the causes of humanitarian crisis, that's when you start to think about, well, that's a core role or a key role where private sector broadly can play a meaningful role.
I'm going to turn to Rob Acker at the far end, who is CEO of Salesforce.org, a social enterprise born of Salesforce.com, which provides free or heavily discounted technology to the nonprofit sector, including some 15,000 customers in the humanitarian space, if I understand correctly.
Of our 40,000 customers, I would qualify 20,000 of them in the humanitarian space. 6,000 are in education, but in my belief, education is a humanitarian need, so I say 20.
Okay, there we go, humanitarian development nexus coming from the private sector. What struck me about what you guys are doing was that from the moment Salesforce was created, the founder, Mark Benioff, had a very kind of long-term view on philanthropy and decided that 1% of product, 1% of equity, 1% of employee time should go towards changing the world. And that 1% of Salesforce's equity is what created Salesforce.org.
Yes.
I suppose over time you're kind of moving away from just being a product of equity to having a more sustainable approach, but how does that longer term view kind of shape the way you do your philanthropy?
So I think that, kind of jumping off that last conversation, employees are the new humanitarians. And all of that data, there's other data that says that employees, the number one attribute that millennials are looking for when they're looking for a job is to have purpose. And companies need to give them that outlet for purpose. And so if you want to attract and retain talent, you have to have those outlets. Now what we do, and the way we were set up was really quickly, it was a 1-1-1 model. You said time, equity, and product. But our mission is to improve the state of the world, and we've evolved, and we took actually a new humanitarian approach to our model because equity is not a sustainable resource. So the challenge that we had is what we realized is, yes, we do, how do we grow our grants budget? How do we increase our technology impact? And how do we get more of our employees engaged? And how can we really amplify this? So about 5 years ago, we restructured, and we took what the best practices are from the business world, applied them to a nonprofit. We took the best practices of a nonprofit and applied them to the business world, and we came up with a hybrid. The old way of delivering technology traditionally, and what we were doing and other companies do with best intentions, is they would deliver technology for free to the humanitarian space. Now, free is never free because it's like handing somebody a 747 and saying, here's a free 747, $350 million asset, and dumping all the parts on your front lawn, which doesn't really help humanitarian agencies. So we needed to build purpose-built solutions for the marketplace. And by creating this model where we charge just a little bit, we could hire engineers and build purpose-built solutions for the space. So it became this thing that where we started to create more purpose-built humanitarian technology that allowed us to grow our grants budget. So if you look at kind of how we evolved, is we ended up becoming a nonprofit social enterprise, and from that impact, we were able to go from 60 employees to 1,000. We were able to go from 10,000 people that we were helping to 40,000, and it's growing because technology right now, and the skills that we bring with the 20,000 customers, we learn a lot about what is needed in this space, and so we're not doing, when our employees volunteer, they do about 1 million hours just this year alone. They're going in and helping humanitarian space with technology skills, and technology has changed. We can, you can connect, you can organize, you can scale. If you look at the 68 million displaced people in the world right now, you can create highly personalized outcomes for each and every one of those individuals. Technology is extraordinary now. The question is then how do we cross-collaborate in a multi-sector way and work with the humanitarian sector, organizations like Peter's, to be able to, how do we tap into that employee engagement talent and that technology and work together better. And so what we've been really focused on, I'm proud of, since day one, is really engaging our employees, and it's turned out to be the number one issue. Here we are like 19, 20 years later after starting our Salesforce, we've embraced this model of 7 paid days off for employees.
And is that because you were kind of answering a push from them, or because you were trying to encourage them to get more engaged in these kinds of issues?
Mark Benioff had an extraordinary vision. He was encouraging employees. This was something that was near and dear to his heart. He believed that companies had an obligation to give back to the communities in which they live and work. And he wanted to create a vehicle giving employees 7 paid days off to engage, and we track that. And just like a lot of commercial companies will track, how are you doing in sales performance metrics? We will track, who we would reward the people who are doing some of the most extraordinary things in the most volunteer hours. So I think he was a little bit ahead of the push. Now the push is actually coming from the employee community. They're demanding that we have these models. I think we were lucky because Mark Benioff was a tremendous visionary, saying, I think that we have an obligation to look at to take a stakeholder approach to this solution, not just focus on shareholders. So it was founded the same day. .org was founded the same day the company was founded, when we had no money. So it's pretty easy, he always jokes, it's pretty easy to give away 1% of your equity when you're not really worth much. So he was ahead of his time on that one.
There's so much discussion today about how millennials, and you've just mentioned it, want to be part of the solution to the world's problems, and that there's this energy and drive coming from them. And yet I think often, at least the traditional humanitarian sector doesn't quite know how to leverage that, what to do with it. I'm going to turn to Jerome on my left, who some of you may know from Vine or Snapchat. Jerome Ajare is an entrepreneur who came to fame when in 2017, together with several famous actors, he raised more than $2 million on social media from his followers in about 48 hours for the pending famine in Somalia. And he wanted, from a few of the WhatsApp conversations that Jerome and I have had in the last few days, to give that influence that he had on social media some meaning. He went on to found Laugharn, which is a movement that brings together celebrities and social media influencers and has raised in the last 2 years $9 million from 300,000 donors online for Somalia, for the earthquake in Mexico, and for the Rohingya refugee crisis. And Jerome, I'm just fascinated as one of these millennials that everyone talks about and wants to tap into, who has this energy and this influence. How do you kind of view this debate? Because I think for many people, and I'll be very honest, when I first heard your story, I thought, okay, here's another amateur who's like getting into this space and trying to feel good about himself. And yet, actually, now when I hear you talk, you're talking about accountability, you're talking about beneficiary empowerment, you're talking about monitoring. I mean, you talk like a professional aid worker. And so I'm interested in that kind of evolution that you've made and where you see yourself in this space.
Hi. I want to tell that 2 years ago, when we started, we knew absolutely nothing. And it's important to remind this because we tend to discredit when people come with a different background and know nothing, when in fact that's exactly what the space needs. We came outside of the box. We didn't know the box. We didn't study Humanitarian. We didn't know the rules, so it was easy to break them. And we basically had a white canvas, which is the best place to start when you want to create change and innovation. And so I'm not scared to say that we knew nothing. And when you know nothing, you have to ask the right questions to do a quantum jump, so you can learn fast. And that leads us to start spending so much time on the ground in Somalia, in the Rohingya camp in Bangladesh. Like I've spent basically the last 2 years in the field, asking always that same question: how can we help you? Is this good enough? Do you have better ideas? How should we do it? And I don't think we ask these questions anymore because we think we know. We think we know how long has the UN existed, how long has all this space has been existed. So we need to re-ask this question: what do they want? We need to re-ask what do they want, because sometimes we're not giving them what they want, and there is enough money raised to give them what they want. So for us, it's been a quantum jump from we were shipping a flight of food to Somalia, and then when we arrived there, we say, "Is this good?" They say, "No." They said, "It's not good. Can you buy locally, at least minimum, so that you spend you help the Somalia economy?" Of course. So we change our plans, and we are very public about when we change our plans online, which helps, I think, educate the young people that follow us on how to help better. Then later, from keeping to ask the question, is this good enough? Do you have better ideas? We learned maybe we could start giving the cash directly to them. We don't need to buy the food for them. Because maybe what can they do with rice and oil and like the traditional humanitarian package? Then they're gonna get out of poverty with it, then they're gonna educate the kids with it. So we started giving cash and we saw much better results. And from keeping asking, we questioning ourselves all the time because we know nothing, then it leads us to start creating jobs instead of giving cash. Even a higher level of empowerment, even better results. In the Rohingya camp, we've created 3,000 jobs. And what shocks me is we only had a $2 million budget, yet we're some of the group that has hired the most people in the camp. And to me, that doesn't make sense. There's a lot of things in the humanitarian sector that don't make sense.
I'm going to turn to Peter, actually, to respond to that. But just for those in the back, there are some couches at the back if you want to scuttle over and you can get a seat. Peter Maurer, of course, you all know who he is, president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the oldest humanitarian organization in the world.
The oldest is not Peter, by the way.
Peter is very young and full of energy. But you know, an organization that has been doing what Jerome has learned to do in the last 2 years since 1863. And so I wonder how you look at a case like this where you're like, yeah, you've been on the learning curve that we went through decades ago. We already know all this. You didn't have to learn it from scratch yourself. And yet, there's a certain energy that comes from people like this. How do you react to Jerome and his story?
Well, I think it's a great story, and Jerome's story is a great story, and many others are. And at the end of the day, you see, when you come from such an old organization, we also recognize the enormous problems in the humanitarian sector. I am always the first one to recognize that traditional humanitarianism does certain good stuff, and I think we have to say that up front. But then, it is also true that we live in extraordinary time. The gap between what is needed today and what we are able to provide by the traditional model of doing is just enormous, and we have to recognize that we are failing on millions of people to whom we are not able to service. So there must be something else which has to be tried out, which delivers better results. People also tell us, and Jerome is right, when we listen carefully to those who receive humanitarian assistance, how many times have I been to places where people tell me, it's nice what you are giving, but it's not actually what we want. So it is important to listen what people want and to adapt what humanitarianism is. And I think technology has been mentioned. It is, of course, we are living in a transformational world which connects people in a very different way, which allows for a different way of engagement than traditional humanitarianism did with regard to intermediary organization collecting money and delivering services to people. We are living in a transformational society which connects us in a different way and allows for new potential of tapping in. And so I'm deeply convinced that we need a new movement which is, of course, can come also from traditional organizations reflecting on what they have learned in the past and where their limits are, and trying to reach out to new forms of investing and engaging in humanitarian context. So it's critically important to connect. And then I'm coming from the Red Cross movement, and I have always to remind us about the myth of creation of this movement. It has not been Henri Dunant creating the movement. It has been the women of Solferino and Castiglione confronted with 40,000 dying soldiers which mobilized themselves and created a humanitarian movement. So it is the society, and I think what Jerome and others have taught already this morning is legitimate given the seriousness of the situation in which the world is today, and many victims are in today's world. Civil society has to reclaim the humanitarian space. And then we can discuss what are good ways of doing it. Where do we need to substitute ourselves because people can't help themselves alone? And when does this model come to an end, and when have we to move into empowering and building on local structures? And here again, I'm just back from the Sahel. How wrong is our image most of the time about the context in which we operate? We still believe that these are helpless places where we need to substitute ourselves fully for social services which do not exist. And we see that it is not true. People help themselves, they are their own first responders. And so the question today is a very different one from what we have seen in certain other crises in the past. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not spitting on traditional humanitarianism here. There are situations where standard operation procedures of what big organizations have done in the humanitarian system is actually what is needed. But I think there is a big space out there which needs to be reclaimed, and you didn't want to talk about collaboration, but I think at the end of the day, it then also boils down how do we connect in an innovative and different way. Because each of us representing organization has different skills and setups. And so the big puzzle that we need to do is, what is the connection? Who brings what to the table, and how can we connect it in a way which delivers impact for people?
I didn't not want to talk about collaboration, but what I often hear is just this, like, we all need to collaborate. Realistically, how do you see the relationship evolving? People like Tara, until today, are still getting treated like, this is our space, and you need to prove why you deserve to be in this space. What is going to...
my attitude.
not yours. But that's what's fascinating
Tara
for me.
That it's not my attitude.
But Peter, you've
it's
faced a lot of resistance
it's-
for the stance that you've taken
It's
towards
very
being
simple.
so...
I would be the first one from a traditional organization saying that those who are there are defining who is at the table. You have to be at the place where needs are. And so proximity to people, context, and needs is basically what makes the difference and what makes you graduate to be a shareholder and a stakeholder in defining what the next humanitarianism is. You can't be absent from far away. You have to be ready to be there. And at the end of the day, that's where humanitarian action has to reconnect and reshape by people who are ready to be there. I mean, Jerome was in Bangladesh and has seen the Rohingyas in the camps. That makes that he has a legitimacy to be there. And I think that's what makes the difference. Either you are there or you are not. And I think we are complaining, and rightly so, in the humanitarian sector, that there are organizations who are there, and there are organizations who are simply not there, and who are only fundraising in capitals of the world and do not translate from advocacy into presence and solidarity. And at the end of the day, you can't imagine a future humanitarian sector without some fundamentals which are outside textbooks, and that's solidarity amongst people who are ready to do something for those who are in need.
I like that idea of civil society having to reclaim humanitarianism. You talked about local people helping themselves and being at the forefront. I'm going to turn to Mayuri now. Mayuri, Bhattacharjee. Actually, if you can pass down the mic, that would be great. But there's another, wonderful, and hopefully it works. Mayuri is the founder and head of programs of Sikun Relief Foundation, which is a very small local organization working in northeastern India, in Assam, and is hit by flooding almost every year. And I was careful when we asked you to join. I don't want to give the impression that local responders are new humanitarians, because local responders have always been at the heart of humanitarian response, as Peter just said. I think what is new is the humanitarian sector finally recognizing that, and at least at a policy level claiming to want to empower people like you. And in the last 3 years in particular, since the World Humanitarian Summit, localization, as it's called, has been, you know, center stage in a lot of these debates. And I'm wondering on the ground whether that has actually translated into you feeling more empowered as a local relief organization to do what you do, and whether you feel that you have a voice.
As an organization, yes, after 2 years we do find it easier, but it's not because of the international humanitarian community, it's because we've been working in the communities which are in flooded areas, and because of their trust. Yes, we do find a seat at the table where these discussions are going, but that seat is sometimes very low, and our voice is not heard very properly. When we do voice our opinions, we feel that because of the less height of the seat, it's not really heard properly. So despite being there on paper, that we should be a part of bigger discussions, sometimes we do feel disenfranchised, and but I wouldn't complain about it because I am from Assam, I belong to that place. If I give up, then I don't think outside actors can work, and I've been there, out there. I'm not asking for funding right now. We have our own networks. What we ask for is more visibility. And yes, in Assam, I would say that it needs more work. Speaking from a very micro perspective, and Assam, I think that action of localization is yet to be translated into action. And there's still a phenomenon what we face as local organization is donor arrogance, that we are too big for you, and we know it for years. So sometimes, that, like Jerome was talking about, we are new, you're not taken seriously. We do face that at certain levels.
And what's your vision when Peter talks about, you know, a day in which people, communities affected by crises would be in a position to take care of themselves? Does that feel tangible at all to you? Does that feel anywhere in the near future possible?
I do feel the places that where we work mostly with women. And during a crisis, women are left out of certain solutions, and solutions are imposed pretty top down, and quite often their voice is not factored. We work on menstrual health, and we work in the communities which are flooded, and we see social enterprises in the communities playing a huge role. I need to feel that communities are not always helpless. Because in Assam, people have been coping with floods for quite a number of years. We need a bit of nudges, and I think in Assam, in the future, people will be self-reliant to a great extent, and but yeah, we need to give more voice to the people. We need to listen what Jerome was talking about, what they want, and that's how the reality will be fulfilled.
Peter number 2 has been waiting patiently, and I want to hear from you now, Peter. So Peter Laugharn is the CEO and president of Conrad Hilton Foundation, and Conrad Hilton Foundation, to my mind, has been one of the outliers in the sense that a lot of foundations, at least in my naive or uninformed perspective, were focused on things like arts and culture and domestic issues. And it's only in recent years, I think, that we've seen more of an alignment within the philanthropic community around the Sustainable Development Goals and some of these wider international issues. And yet, humanitarian emergencies, complex emergencies, fragile states are still a rather big blind spot for a community that likes to consider itself to be quite risk-taking and, in fact, is not very present in these spaces. And the reason we asked Peter to join us is that Conrad Hilton Foundation has been trying to push the philanthropic community to engage more in fragile states. So I'd love to hear from you why. Why do you see that as important, and what kind of traction you're getting in the community?
Sure, thanks. I think foundations go on a kind of journey.
Like everyone.
Yeah, we start as morning after funders, usually natural disasters, or acute refugee situations, and we respond as best we can, but often don't have much context. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, and then I think we'll start looking at disaster preparedness and mitigation. And then after a while we say, wait a second, we want to do more good than we can do retail, if you like. We want to buy more than $1 worth of good with $1 worth of grants. And we start looking at points of leverage in the system. And I think that's the way we should all be looking, all of these actors who are here today. We've got a humanitarian system where some of us are 150 years old, but the whole system itself, as we know it now, is 70 years old. It's a bit of a smokestack industry, set up for different conditions and struggling. I think I don't impugn anybody's work, but we're working in a system that was not set up to deal with the situation that we've got now, and that situation is going to get worse. We're looking at a century of dislocation, if not more. We're looking right now at dislocation that is mostly political now, and that's not going to ease up, but we'll see much more climate-related dislocation in the decades to come. We need a system that is going to be able to work with that. And then we'll also have a place for organizations like Mayuri's. You know, we talk about localization, and the reason for that, of course, is that only less than 1% of the resource flows in a $25 billion industry are going directly to organizations that are on the ground. Now, we've made a commitment as a community to increase that to 20 or 25%, but there really isn't a game plan. There are some technical problems to be ironed out, but they're mostly political problems about who wants resources to flow through their organizations and through their teams. And for one of the things I think foundations can do, since they don't have skin in that game, since we're not players in that system, the players being mainly the UN organizations, the large international NGOs, and bilaterals, I think we can try to help everyone conceive a system that would work differently. The two things I think, aside from capital, that foundations can put on the table, since we're structured to exist in perpetuity, a century isn't a long time. Now, we can help the world take a longer-term view on what it needs to do. And since we should be less bureaucratic than others, we should also be able to move quickly when necessary. And I think those are the two things that foundations can bring if we're on our game. And that's one of the things, Heba, that we're talking about with foundations, because there's the potential and then there's the actuality. And I think complex emergencies and fragile states have not been attractive places for foundations to try to make grants, mostly because our due diligence is not set up for that. I think probably similar to corporations. I think we have to work on that, look at de-risking for foundations and through foundations.
Is that happening? Are you seeing it?
Yeah, I think so. You know, one thing is our grant making was set up mostly in the 19th and early 20th centuries. You make a big annual grant, you ask for a report a year later, and things, they move really slowly. But Tara can tell you about how we could get that money on the ground tomorrow and know about it the day after, right? I think there's been a lot of discussion about getting money to individuals efficiently. There hasn't been a lot of discussion about getting money to organizations efficiently, and I think that's something that we could all do together.
You've been seeing here kind of a cross-section of what we at IRIN are calling the new humanitarians and how the landscape is changing. One of the things that you mentioned off the top, Tara, was that you know, it isn't just about, for example, when the private sector is getting involved, it's not just about helping the UN deliver aid better, but, and you've now referenced it too, Peter, it's about flipping the whole system. And I'm a member of the Humanitarian Council at the World Economic Forum that Tara and Peter chair, and one of the things we've been talking a lot about is market-based approaches to humanitarianism, if we use that word in the broader sense of the word, and how investors can help change the game in helping create local economies that are able to absorb shocks and allow people to get back on their feet faster. So I just wanted to turn actually to Shruti in the audience. to get an investor's view on where investment fits in this kind of new humanitarianism. If we could get a microphone over to her. Shruti Mehrotra is the Director of Policy at the Open Society Foundations and works with the Soros Economic Fund to actually invest in fragile states. So, are you a new humanitarian?
With humility, we are. I think one of the things that resonated a lot with us, which comes from the migration community, is this notion of a whole of society approach to thinking about migrants. And thus, in thinking about the humanitarian sector, it's something that we come with as well, but again, as I said, with humility, is that there's a role for corporations, of course, the role for the traditional humanitarians, new actors, and indeed, I think we are really excited about this trajectory towards localization, and particularly for the investment community, a lot of the things that we can imagine investing in are very local. So they're about social entrepreneurs and indeed entrepreneurs from the communities that we are talking about in the way that we've spoken about in the council about local economies. And so we have, for example, invested in SME financing facilities in environments that have large refugee influxes, where those SMEs employ refugees as well as vulnerable parts of the local population. I think the challenge for the investment community, frankly, is a lot of these subjects are still very unknown and quite scary. So when we talk about what are thought of as the hyper-fragile context, investors really balk at the notion of investing in some of these environments, even though we are very cognizant that they are some of the areas of the highest need. And so how we help take, especially starting off with the impact investment community that already is thinking long and hard about how to make social impact with their dollars. And we are extremely excited at how big the impact investment community over these last 10 years has gotten. There's a journey that we need to go down in sort of transitioning and sort of kind of in bite-sized ways getting the impact community and indeed larger scale investors involved. And thus, there's a question about how we frame the question as to, I think of it as an aperture. If we start talking about infrastructure in some of these environments, that's very easy for investors to talk about. If we are, on the other hand, talking about certain kinds of businesses, they may not go through our due diligence process in the same way that it would for some of our grant capital. So what I would say is I think we're very, humbly interested in being involved in these, but it's going to be a journey for investors to get involved, particularly in some of the more risky and harder contexts.
I want to stay in the audience for just a minute, and I wonder if there's anyone from, and I now it's starting to get pejorative, these words like traditional humanitarian and new humanitarian, but from traditional agencies, UNHCR, WFP, who could just react a little bit to what you're seeing up here. And again, I'm not looking for the kind of we all need to collaborate, but traditionally it has been really hard to incorporate these new faces. So how do you deal with that challenge? And if you could just introduce yourself.
Sure, my name is Robert Opp. I'm the Global Head of Innovation for the World Food Programme. I'm also standing beside a UNHCR colleague, so she may want to comment as well. But, I think, first, I agree with everything Peter said, and we've had lots of discussions around this, and I agree with most of the comments made on this panel.
Which ones don't you agree with, Robert?
Come to that in a second, no. No, I mean, I think the fundamental premise or the fundamental context is that we are not able to reach everyone that we need to reach. And so we know that as traditional actors, that we are not able to have the reach. And the answer is not just making us a huge amount bigger. We do need more entries, more people working in this space. The second thing is that we need to move from delivery to beneficiaries to customer service. And this was some of the comments already made about recognizing that we are now at a time where, out of almost necessity and legacy, we developed a kind of like a wholesale or a bulk model of assistance where whole swaths of populations get similar packages of assistance because that was all the tools that we had at our availability at the time. It is no longer that case. We can now leverage technology and other kinds of platforms to reach people on a much more one-to-one basis that really understands their needs and be responsive to that. But to do that, we need the expertise of other players in the system to work with us. So that is, I think that what we're seeing right now in terms of how do we engage with other players, I think we see the kind of new technologies as a major way to do that. We see lots of other kinds of collaboration with investors and working in nuanced ways in context. So it is not just that you have a humanitarian context and a non-humanitarian context. You have situations that have various degrees of complication, various degrees of risk, but we need to work with others to see where we can get investment in places that need to have investment and can sustain investment, and places that need more pure delivery of services because the situation simply won't allow otherwise security and so on. So I think it's just becoming much more nuanced, both in terms of the way we see ourselves playing and acting in the space as the way that we serve people that we are meant to serve. The one thing I would say is, and I haven't heard a lot of so far, is we do, I think, a multiplicity of players is a good thing, but humanitarian principles need to stay universal. And so we do need to kind of agree that if others are coming into this space, there is a certain principle layer that we should agree on before we are just doing anything that we want to do in this space.
So Jerome, I see you kind of jittering in your seat. How do you react to that? That, you know, if you're going to come into the space, you got to play by the rules, in a sense.
I was just surprised to see WFP speaking here. I would like to say to jump on you're very reasonable. I really like what you said, that I think it was very tolerant that we need to sorry, let me reframe. I think we shouldn't be scared to say that the big monopolies right now in the humanitarian space, the UN and all those gigantic organizations, are doing a really it just doesn't work. It just really doesn't work. And we should really be willing to question all of that and not be scared of it. And it's okay, you know? Like, I don't want to be scared of talking about this. And we've been pressured a lot. And I think everyone in that space feels pressure because there's careers. There's careers at place, right? Like, you're gonna work for the Red Cross, then you're gonna work for WFP, then you're gonna work for the Red Crescent, then you're gonna work for another one. And so you don't want to close any door to yourself, right? But the individuals, you've seen that, right? I'm sure you've seen that. But the individuals within this company, within this organization, like you, are very sweet, are very amazing people. Everyone is amazing, everyone is great. We're not saying that there's bad people, okay? I think it's important to clarify that. The problem is in the system. Is it okay to say that?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. No. I don't believe there's bad people. That's the thing. I'm saying there's no bad people.
But I think the inherent challenge is the system
So
became a system for a reason, because there was a need to professionalize, because there was too much amateurism. And so there's these two tensions, right? Because the amateurism brings that kind of soul and being close to the people and so on. But it also brings, in some cases, some harm because you don't know the humanitarian principles, because you might end up doing things that hurt.
Who is doing the harm, honestly? I've seen people dying from, like, the shit rights they receive from the giant organization. So it doesn't take 20 years of humanitarians to know how to help someone. If your mom is starving, are you gonna figure it out? And what are you gonna bring her? Are you gonna bring her a bag of rice? Are you gonna bring her a restricted card that she can only buy in your store? That's the restricted cash happening at scale right now in the humanitarian sector. Are you gonna ask her what she wants and really empower her and make yourself small? Okay, let's get into the topic. What's really bothering us in the camp right now in Bangladesh, and what's bothering all the Rohingya, is a heavy, for example, it's one example, the heavy branding. How much branding is happening in the humanitarian sector? Like, we've turned poverty into a brand. We've turned helping into a brand. You walk in this camp, there's logos everywhere.
But
Every single tarp has a logo on it.
Are you
Every
going to
single
be
bag
able
of
to
rice
scale your
has a logo
approach
on
to
it.
the 135 million people in need of aid today?
Absolutely, we have new ideas that could be scaled. We have new ideas that work at scale. And you know, everything we've done, we've never put a logo on. Because if you were helping your mom, you wouldn't put a logo on it. That's disgusting. And every single tarp that people living in this camp, first, the tarp is shit. Why are they sleeping in tarp? How much money has been raised for them? They shouldn't be sleeping in tarp. Why are they eating rice? Why? You can't survive on rice. So, and why do you put your logo on it? And why do you think it's okay? And why everyone is doing it? And why everyone is looking at us like we shouldn't put our nose into this?
So we don't want to turn this into a...
Absolutely not.
No, but actually, Jerome told me himself before we got on stage, you know, in the beginning it's easy to evilify, I think as you put it, the UN, and we don't want to do that anymore because it doesn't help anyone. So I don't think that's what this is about. But there is a raw energy that comes from people like you in this space, and that is inherently in tension with a more professionalized approach to humanitarianism. And I think part of the challenge today is how do we resolve that tension? And maybe Peter and Tara might have some reactions to that.
I think, this is on, yeah. I think,
just hold it. Let me close
yeah, I appreciate the raw energy and I appreciate the emotion. I think not because it's right, not because it's wrong. I think neither side is right or wrong. This sounds like a really diplomatic, namby-pamby answer. But I do think that we need to bring the dialogue from one of who's right and who's wrong down to practical, tactical means to collaborate. And collaborate cannot be a concept. I want to go back to what Peter was saying. If we really think that we can leverage private sector, it's not saying is it private, is it millennials, or is it traditional? It's saying what are the core competencies of the respective organizations and how do you bring them together in a tactical way? Peter's organization does crazy stuff that no private sector can ever do. He goes and negotiates with governments and terrorists and goes into hard to reach places that frankly my security will never allow me to go. But there are other side of the organizations where you do have NGOs who are opening MFIs, banks in Indonesia. So I think the question that needs to be asked is, why are they doing that if I'm willing to do it as a private sector organization? And how can we more effectively allocate the dollars and the energies in a way such that both can play those roles? That if OSF wants to invest in a fragile market, will they invest in Nigeria? Sure. Will they invest in, the Congo? Maybe not today, right? Maybe it's tomorrow. But sort of how do we start to find those sweet spots where everyone wants to play a role? And it's not just I'm gonna say this, I'm gonna say a couple examples. Because we have a tendency to talk about collaboration at the 100,000-foot level, we never actually get to collaborating. There are legal challenges and barriers for us to actually ever do anything. It's impossible for me as a private sector organization to actually have public sector monies invest alongside us. It's very, very difficult. Because the second a government dollar comes even near me, we have to say we will relinquish rights to the IP, number one. Number two, as a public corporation, Mastercard brand, right? Hundreds of billions of dollars in market cap. I've got to accept unlimited liability, third-party liability, if I'm going to take $1 of public sector money. That's never going to happen. So sometimes I think there are rules, like rules around RFPs and getting multiple respondents to an RFP that are right, and they're there to be proper custodians of public money. But sometimes there are rules, and frankly there are unspoken rules, there are cultural barriers that are just meant to keep the outsiders out. So I think we need to do a better job of differentiating what are the good rules, what are the ones that are meant to be protectors of humanitarian principles, of public sector monies, and what are the ones that are really just there to keep the new players out.
Just very much in the same way, Heba, to confirm you are right, there is an inherent tension between professionalism in a sector and voluntarism in the sector. And again, my organization and the Red Cross and the Crescent movement has done managing the tension over the last 100 years, because there is legitimacy in voluntarism, as Jerome has said, and there is a place for principled humanitarianism as well. That's obvious. I think the problem is that we don't have an elaborated conversation on it. That
Doesn't it feel like we're always having conversations about it, actually?
Sorry?
It feels like we're always having conversations about it.
Yeah, well, there is not a structured conversation exactly in the way that Tara has explained beforehand. We have it at too much level, and I think my second point would be that the whole collaboration is a wrong word. Because at the end of the day, what Tara says beforehand is it's about leveraging the skills and competencies and insights of each one of us in the area where we are best. And that's putting together different elements into a puzzle which is more than the single elements. And that's not necessarily doing the same things together. And I think that's the big sort of continuous misunderstanding around collaboration is that it suggests that we are doing things together, while it is exactly trying to combine things that are complementary to each other. As Tara rightly has said, I think we are pretty good in frontline humanitarian negotiations with a lot of difficult people. And I think we have managed to show that we are able to securitize the humanitarian space in which people are active. But it doesn't mean that we want to do everything in that space. We have certain skills and others have other skills. And I think that's exactly what Tara has mentioned before. As long as we are just in meeting, calling for collaboration, this won't happen. And I think Tara and myself, we have now gone through quite some time of co-chairing councils and finding out how much you have to be concrete and topical and contextual and try to find out what really works on the ground. And I think that's what it is really about. My last point I want to make also, wrong words for wrong things. Several times this morning, again, we talked about localization. I think it's just yet another word which comes with a fashion which is wrong. At the end of the day, it's about combining local skills and insights with national, international policy and advocacy roles that are legitimate as well. And here again, we are always falling into the trap of words which are basically wrong because they hide reality instead of unfolding what the reality is.
We're going to have to wrap. Before we do, I just want, in one sentence, from anyone who wishes to offer, what humanitarian action or humanitarianism will look like in 20 years. Go ahead, Peter, and then we'll pass it down.
I get that one. Okay. What this reminds me of is IBM and Apple. Sorry, this reminds me of IBM and Apple. We have very established players, we have new ones. That's natural. And that tension helps each side grow. And I would like to see innovation at the legacy level, if you like, and strengthening, deepening at the new entrant level. But I think the difference for me is that IBM and Apple, they're competing for a market that is being created. Here we know what the overall mandate is and what, we all need to rise to work on it together. And I think we should remember that $25 billion in the system sounds like a lot of money, but it's not nearly enough for what needs to happen.
I'll give my one line.
Okay.
In the future, I would love to see a world where we all just consider ourselves humanitarians.
succinct. I like
You
it.
said one sentence.
I did.
Right,
We'll try to stick to one
I
sentence.
think we have two futures in front of us. There's one future where we keep doing things as they are, and there's going to be hundreds of millions of refugees, maybe 300 millions. That's the expectations. Or there's another future where we innovate and we involve artists. I think a big misconception is the people that are creating new ideas for our work, they're not celebrities, they are artists at the core. They became famous because of the art. And we need to leverage the creative geniuses. We are not involving artists anymore, enough. You know, we're not involving artists enough in the humanitarian sector. That's one word we haven't used today, art. Artists, you know. They have this, so that's our hope. My hope, if there is hope, is it's going to be in something that doesn't exist yet, new ideas. And we have tons of new ideas. And I believe in them. I believe with those new ideas, we can solve this problem.
Because I come from a state in India called Assam, and quite often we say that we suffer from something called the tyranny of distance, because we are very far away from the capital. And every year floods happen, and every year citizens of Assam and people who are affected complain that there's not enough media attention. I want that to change in the future. I want media and also other local actors to respond, maybe if not equally, but at least be sensitive to this crisis which happens every year. Every year 1.5 million people are affected in floods in Assam, the place where I work. And yet we sometimes cry for attention, and that's why we don't have enough innovations coming. I want that to change. I want everyone, not only with the people here, the humanitarians. I think media can play a better role as a humanitarian, which IRIN is doing, but also we have to focus on areas which maybe are not at present international crisis, but there has to be more local media coverage, and that's what, in my context, I come from a very hyper-local context, but I feel media coverage from my area will help us a lot.
I think the fastest way to get to the heart of the tension is through things that we have available today. With technology, we can connect, we can connect with each one of the 68 million people who are displaced right now in personal ways. That's available today. And if we want to talk about things like the word localization or really understanding what's at the heart of what's going on, we need data and we need information. Businesses have customers. They know everything about their customers. And those are the intended recipients of their services. We need to understand the intended recipient needs of the people that we're trying to serve. And they have access, they can communicate with us. You mentioned very rightly so, like we need a way to reach them. They need a way to reach us too, and tell us what's going on, what's working and what's not working. Because we can sit and we can debate like who could be doing what better, or there are new models and this and that. The fastest way to know what these new models are, and the fastest way to know what already works in the system, is have a direct connection from them, use data, aggregate that data, and we can stop that tension and we can start focusing on how we can collaborate much, much more closely.
You had to end with collaboration.
Yeah, but collaboration only comes when you actually can surround the actual intended recipients with all the services we provide. We all provide something very unique, and when we understand where to slide each other in and where there's gaps, because every situation is a little bit different, every individual is a little bit different, and that's the only way that we can kind of truly effectively collaborate in an efficient way.
Can I just add that we are really pro-collaboration? I don't want to say the wrong message. The problem is the only collaboration we are being offered is like wear a t-shirt with a logo on it. That doesn't excite us. When we have ideas, let's talk about them.
Peter, do you have a final closer? Tara's advocating for the last word to go to you. The future of humanitarianism.
I'm a very conservative person, so I can only imagine the future as a continuation of the past.
That is not the appropriate ending.
So, on a more serious note, I think the humanitarian sector is a very dynamic sector, and I would envisage a future in which we manage those polarities which we have been discussing this morning, principled and pragmatic, local and global, traditional and innovative, and I think we are out of balance at the present moment, and we need to find a new, at least, intermediary balance in the system which gives a better deal for people, because at the end of the day, it's not about the system. At the end of the day is whether we manage to service for people in need and suffering from natural disaster and conflict, whether we are able to service. So that's the threshold of whether we are in better balance in any future in 5, 10, 15 or 20 years.
I hope this has served as something of an introduction for the many discussions that will follow this week at Davos. There is an event tomorrow, in fact several events throughout the week around especially the investing piece in humanitarian contexts. So Sarah, if you want to put your hand up, has a bit more info on that, if anyone is interested.
Yes, thanks, Heba. And actually, it really goes to the heart of what you're saying, because this tension is positive between the traditional and the new humanitarians, but it is about getting together and starting to co-design, which is what we're trying to do tomorrow in the breakfast between investors and some of those who are more traditional in the space, is taking that conversation forward and starting to think how we create investable opportunities where we can all collaborate. So it's at 7 o'clock. For those who are interested, come and talk to me afterwards, and we can give you more details. But I think it's also important to end on a positive note. It's true we've been having these discussions for a long time, but we are making progress. The fact that we've got such a strong humanitarian agenda at this year's Davos, the council has been at the heart. I'm also a member of the council with Bhattacharjee and Heba.
Sarah Bhattacharjee is the acting executive director of the Overseas Development Institute.
And a board member of IRIN as well.
And the board member.
But it is actually been a journey that is very positive, because to have such a strong agenda, humanitarian agenda at the heart of Davos 2019, it's a testament to what this community is trying to do, to reach out to new humanitarians, to work differently, to take these collaborations and these discussions onto a different space. And I think we need to continue to work to make these complementarities real, and to challenge those in our traditional sector who are not prepared to move beyond, because they'll be left behind. In 20 years' time, they will not be here. But we need to continue to harness the complementarity between those who
will not be here in 20 years' time?
The traditional humanitarians who are not prepared to embrace.
Now that is a non-diplomatic answer. Peter, you can learn from Sarah.
I'm really retired.
Look at what's happened to, Nokia in the mobile telephone space. That's the problem. If you don't innovate, if you don't change, if you don't think differently, you'll struggle and progressively disappear. So that's what we need to do, continue to challenge the traditions, but also those who come to the space. We need to bring the experience that is positive, that comes from the traditional sector, and make co-design, co-think. We need that raw energy as the traditional humanitarians, because yes, the sector has lost a bit of its soul, and we need to rediscover that.
We're going to leave it at that. For those of you who are new to this sector, new to the field, IRIN and soon the new Humanitarian does hope to be a source for you of information on the ground and a lot of these policy debates. So please do subscribe. You can do so for free on our website. For now, it is irinnews.org. And thank you so much for being here with us today.